Texas is dealing with major injuries right now. Yeah, I don't think it matters very much.
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I am your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your daily source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Realignment, coaching, carousel, the portal, and so much more, with record predictions. Getting you ready for the season. Today's episode brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. Make every moment more. All customers are hooked up via FanDuel with a boost or a bonus daily. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long, and they've got all the college football you want. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Florida is not making a bowl game. LSU just might be in the SEC championship game by lieu of their schedule. All coming up on today's show, but we start with Texas. So, over the last week, you've probably heard in this corner or that corner on Twitter or here or seen it there that Texas lost 2 of their projected starting, probably 4 running backs. CJ Baxter is the name you need to know. He was going to be, in all likelihood, their number 1 guy. Now, are running backs worth a lot? That depends. That depends on the type of system you run. That depends on what kind of team you are. That depends on who you have at the quarterback position. And ask yourself this question. This is why my confidence in Texas has not wavered in a sizable way. I was leaning closer to 11-1. I'll tell you why it's 10-2 in just a moment. But I don't see Texas in a dramatically different light. You know who else doesn't? Vegas. If you look at the point spreads for Texas's biggest games, Georgia, Michigan, Oklahoma, they haven't moved. They have not budged. Texas's win total, still 10.5. Their conference title odds, they haven't moved. It's still second in the SEC to Georgia. Vegas doesn't think this is a big move. And guess what? I'm not saying it's great. If I'm Texas, would I rather have CJ Baxter? Of course. Tremendously talented guy. It sucks that he's going to miss the season. Do you ever hear the phrase recruiting matters? These would be the instances that put on full display why recruiting matters. Because CJ Baxter, first of all, having Quinn Ewers at quarterback gives me a lot of confidence. You look at the rest of the weapons on this Texas offense, they've reloaded in a really, really strong way. And I think their roster is one of the 5 to 10 best in all of college football. You can debate it here or there or however you would like. It's probably one of the 5 best in all of college football. But the question you then ask yourself, once you know that the supporting cast around the running back, which I'd say is a feature of the offense, but not the primary component. So it's not Christian McCaffrey at Stanford where everything runs through him. You lose Christian McCaffrey from those old Stanford teams that he was on that, won Rose Bowl in 2016. Yeah, okay, that team is dramatically different. But this isn't that for 2 reasons. Number one, like I mentioned, Quinn Ewers, weapons, offensive line going to be really, really good. It's all there. That allows running backs to succeed. Number 2, you've got a great offensive coordinator in Steve Sarkisian, who gives them the ability to overcome an injury like this. And number 3, perhaps most importantly, who's the guy that they have on the roster to replace him? Oh, it's Jaden Blue. How many teams in the SEC would Jaden Blue start for? Probably quite a few. He's going to start for Texas. If Jaden Blue stays healthy, this Texas running game is not going to be significantly reduced. Not to the effect to where they're not able to run the football, where they don't have a reliable ground game, where they can't incorporate their running back into the offensive play calling. It's not hamstringing their offense. It's not as if it's a top receiver who was the only kind of go-to guy, and all of a sudden you've taken him out of the rotation. Does it hurt? Yes. There may be a couple instances, a play here or there. If Jaden Blue goes down with an injury, then you're going to think about the CJ Baxter injury really more, or a lot more than you otherwise should. But I think Texas is going to be completely fine. Jaden Blue is going into his 3rd year of college football, 4-star recruit. He ran for almost 400 yards on 65 carries a season ago. He was over 6 yards a carry and 3 touchdowns. It's not going to be his first time playing college football. So all these factors line up with a schedule that works in Texas's favor. So how are they going to get to 10-2? They'll start with a win against against Colorado State in week 1. Then they will go at Michigan. I have that Michigan game where they're a 3.5-point favorite, still a 3.5-point favorite, even after the CJ Baxter news, and the Texas A&M game last week of the regular season. That feels like a split. That feels like a split. I might be slightly more confident had Baxter and Blue been there and you had that dynamic running back tandem in the backfield, but I still think they're going to be able to run the football because you've got a good offensive line, which is generally, along with the offensive head coach or whoever the offensive coordinator is, far more determinative of a running back success than the running back himself. But certainly Baxter is a loss to the offense. I think they're probably going to go in and beat Michigan week 2, and that game at Texas A&M last week of the year, it's going to be a crazy crowd. It's going to be a crazy crowd. We'll see how good Texas A&M is. So I'm putting 10-2 on the books here for Texas because then they play UTSA, UL Monroe, Mississippi State, neutral site against Oklahoma. You never rule out anything in Red River. I lean towards Texas in that game. Georgia at home, I think that's a loss. Do you realize how few true road games Texas plays this year? It's not a big number. It's not a big number. They go at Vandy. That's one of them. That barely even counts. Florida, home, Arkansas, Kentucky, Texas A&M. This schedule bends incredibly favorably for this Texas team. I think if you had last year's Texas team with this schedule, they also go 11-1. And I think Texas is most of what they were a year ago, but not all of what they were a year ago. And, Steve Sarkisian, I asked him in SEC Media Days about why he feels confident this is the most talented team he's ever had. He gave a good answer. I still don't know. I think there's an element of coach speak worked in there. He talked about the guys who, CJ Baxter, for instance, who, have battled injuries in the past or are going to be, playing a larger role on this year's team than they did in the 2023 team. And all that is good and fine. I'm glad he's confident in his guys because I am at some level as well. I won't go as far to say that this Texas team is better than last year's team. I think you've downgraded at receiver, but you still have an elite receiving core. I think you've downgraded at defensive line. You still have a great defensive line. You lose Sweat and Murphy in the same class. You can't replace those guys one-to-one. You just cannot do it. Not immediately anyway. So I like Texas's roster a lot. I love the transfer portal additions. I think Silas Bolden is going to be a fantastic gadget guy for Steve Sarkisian in this offense. I love the way the schedule shakes out. They don't have too many true road games. They get a tune-up game against Colorado State before they go at Michigan. I think they will win that football game in Ann Arbor. They will lose to Georgia, and we'll see if they have a second loss going into whatever postseason structure they get into at the end of the year against Texas A&M. Because Texas A&M, little bit of an unknown. I know more about Texas than Texas A&M. The Longhorns are favored in that game, but it's going to be about a field goal game. It's 3.5 right now, according to our friends at FanDuel. So that's how Texas can overcome the CJ Baxter injury. I think they are incredibly qualified and capable of doing so. Florida could make a bowl game. Yeah, I'm not predicting that one, though. Not with that schedule. That's coming up next. First, passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. They have superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit, only available to U.S. customers. Florida football is undefeated in 2024 right now. That might not last very long. Brandon Olsen, Locked On Gators, joining me here on the show. This is the toughest schedule in all of college football. This may be the toughest college football schedule we've seen in the last decade plus in the entire sport, Brandon, and it comes at a time where Billy Napier has questions about his job security. Now, I'll say up front, pending the outcome of week 1 against Miami, that I do think Florida is capable of winning at home down in the swamp. I think they are either 5-7 or 4-8. I do not believe they're making a bowl game. I also don't believe it'll lead to Billy Napier's firing because I don't think it's a fair examination of his coaching record to say, hey, as you're rebuilding the program here, go play the hardest schedule we could possibly find.
Fair, but you're screwing up one bit. You're using logic here. And we don't do that. This is the University of Florida. You win games.
Silly me.
Well, yeah. This is the University of Florida. You win games, you get the hell out. That's the approach that they love taking. I do believe that the expectation behind closed doors is win at least 6 games and keep your job. If you win 5, but you look significantly better than you did last year, keep your job. Win 5 games and you look the same as you did against Arkansas and Kentucky last year, you're going to be looking for a new job, but really hefty buyout. So congratulations.
Yeah, the buyout is the saving grace for Billy Napier. I think that he really stabilizes things for a while if he finds a way to start 2-1, which is doable. You have you have one SEC game and a tough ACC game at home because it's Miami, it's Samford, it's Texas A&M before you go at Mississippi State, who might be, along with Vandy, the worst team in the SEC this year. There is a path there to starting 3-1, but you have to beat one of Miami or Texas A&M. And on my official prediction here, Brandon, I've got Texas A&M as a loss. I have Miami as a toss-up. And I think that first game is going to determine a lot about how Gators fans view Billy Napier throughout the course of the season and after.
Yeah, absolutely. I've said this multiple times. I do think that Florida will win both those games. It's not me trying to be like a hardcore homer. I just think that for Miami, they did a lot through the transfer portal this year, trying to go into the swamp, win there week 1. It's tough. And I've said, if this game's week 8, I feel differently, but it's not. This will be the actual live game together with Cam Ward, with that offensive line, with the defense trying to get on the same page, which I know they went out and they brought a bunch of great players all around. Sure, you still got to communicate. You still got to go out there and actually be able to run your system effectively. It's tough to do that in the swamp. We've seen teams with way more experience come into the swamp and lose. Florida hasn't lost a home opener in 3 decades. It's tough to manage that one. And again, like we saw Utah come in, and sure, the temperature played a factor, which, by the way, way more humid in Gainesville than it is in Miami. Like I know that you're still Florida. It's way more humid up in
Brandon,
Gainesville.
are you telling me there's humidity in Florida? This is the first I'm hearing of it.
I'm telling you, it's way more humid in Gainesville than Miami. That is not a joke. Miami, you get a nice little breeze. Gainesville, you die. Like it's hot out there. It's hot. It's humid. It's tough. I do think that Florida should win that game. And it's just how it is. Texas A&M, you got to show me, man. I mean, you're going to be starting a couple guys.
No, if it were Jimbo, I'd be with you. But it's Mike Elko, and I think Elko is excellent. I think Connor Wigman is good. I think one point during the summer, I might have undersold his abilities a little. He's still somewhat unproven, but he can make some, like Connor Wigman, Graham Mertz. I think 6 out of 10 times they play on the same field, Wigman looks like the better quarterback. But if this is one of those 4 times, because it's in the swamp, you never know. Like Graham Mertz is definitely better than most people think. I don't think most people would look at his numbers and say, wow, he was a what percentage completion guy last year? The number was 72, 71. Like, that's a pretty high level. There aren't a lot of guys that are able to hit that clip. I'd feel better about their offense if they had landed Keandre Lambert-Smith from Penn State, but I love the Elijah Badger addition on offense. I think they have enough pieces elsewhere to be capable. Like the schedule just stinks. So I think Miami's my toss-up game for Florida. Samford, that's a win. Texas A&M, I like the Aggies in that spot. We'll see if I feel the same way going into that game. At Mississippi State in Starkville, that's a win. UCF at home, that's a win. At Tennessee, that's a loss. Kentucky at home, that to me is a win. By the way, don't sleep on UCF.
I was going to say I am more scared of UCF than I am of Texas A&M. Texas A&M's defense is going to be starting guys that started on Florida's defense last year.
True, but they're gonna have Mike Elko as their head coach and defensive coordinator influencer at the very least, and Mike Elko is very, very good.
They brought 2 Florida defensive coaches from last year, and they brought 3 Florida defensive players from last year.
Yeah, but they also bring Mike Elko to the table, and I mean,
they also bring those guys. Like they bring Scooby Williams, and I love Scooby, but like he's not an SEC starter.
Not just because he's named after the greatest cartoon of all time.
No, not just because I love his intensity and his fire. I just don't think he's an SEC starter quality.
Okay. Well, we'll see how that goes. We'll see how it goes. I could see him beating Texas A&M. It's not out of the realm of possibility. Right now, I'd pencil that one down as a loss. But the reason this Florida schedule is so unbelievably brutal and could lead to Billy Napier's firing, though I don't suspect that it will, is they go Georgia at Texas, LSU, Ole Miss at Florida State. Look, if you give me a 5-game stretch in which the most winnable game is hosting LSU, who we're going to talk about later on today's show as a team that has got a pretty solid chance of making the playoff, when that's arguably the most winnable game, I might argue Florida State, but it's at FSU, but you don't have to travel that far for it. So at the very least, it's a tough road environment, but you don't have some big cross-country trip or anything of the sorts. But when those are the most winnable games in a stretch, I mean, come on. Is Florida going to win any of those games?
I don't know. Honestly, I think with LSU, a lot of it depends on Garrett Nussmeier and how he's going to adapt here. They got a really good offensive line. It's
completely agree.
A lot of changes defensively. Matt House is out, so we'll see what happens there. They brought in Baker, I think his name is, from Missouri.
Yeah, Blake Baker from Missouri. Had a really good year for the Tigers last season.
Yeah, and Florida's offense had a good game against them up until Graham Mertz got hurt. So we'll see how that matchup goes. I mean, Florida State is one of those schools where they're just replacing a lot of senior production. So I honestly don't even know how to gauge them right now. I know that they're thought of.
I'd say for FSU, with a pretty favorable ACC schedule, they're a lock to win 10-plus games. I don't think they're a national championship contender. They can make the playoff, maybe as an at-large, but probably as an ACC champ. Yep. I don't see them as being as talented as they were a season ago. I think they have downgraded at quarterback. DJU is fine, but he is not great. I think they have a really good roster, but I don't think it's as good as last year's. They'll have a great defensive line, but do they have a guy on there that's as good as Jared Verse? Probably not, and because that's just setting a really high bar. So I think they're about 80 to 85% of what they were a season ago.
Yeah, I think that's my big thing. It's just like they're replacing a lot of good football players. Like their roster makeup last year was really, really good. You had Keon Coleman, Johnny Wilson, you had Trey Benson, you had Jaheim Bell, you had Jared Verse and Braden Fisk on the defensive line. You had 2 draft picks in the secondary. They had a really good football team last year, and you're replacing a lot of that. And it's not just that you're replacing guys like, sure, win 10 games in the ACC. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're a good football team. You got to replace a lot of guys, and I do think that, playoff contender team just because, 10 wins is very achievable for them. But I honestly, like I said, I just don't even know how to gauge them. They're just replacing too much for me to say that I have an opinion of them either way. But I do think that when you look at who Florida has in those final 5, they're the second most winnable game. Ole Miss.
Completely. Well, you think Ole Miss or LSU is more winnable? Because I'd say LSU.
Oh, no, I was saying that Ole Miss is too damn good, and I. Think
okay. I'm glad we're on the same page. But I want to wrap with some clarity here. I have Florida at a 5-7 or a 4-8, pending whether they can win either the Miami game or Texas A&M, which are both possible because they're at home. But I think they miss a bowl game this year. I still think they keep Billy Napier.
Maybe. I have them at 6 wins. I do think that they've really upgraded this roster. I think that they're, again, like, I know this is such a lame thing to say, but these guys, like, they're built, like, culture-wise, they've built a lot. I know that from national perspective, it's, Florida's a dumpster fire. I am telling you factually, inside that facility, they think they're really, really good.
Get out of here with your facts.
Yeah, I don't know if that's good or bad that you think that, but I think that...
As you pointed out earlier, logic looked down upon. Facts, get out of here.
Out the
window. Leave.
Yeah, if you can win one of those games in the last 5, I think you're in a bowl. Just because you should be able to win.
Yeah. I think that's entirely possible.
And having 8 home games definitely helps you.
And by the way, the at Tennessee game is one that I'm tempted to say, ooh, maybe they could win, but the revenge factor for Tennessee, no, I don't see that one in Knoxville. You're talking me into a hard 5-7. Maybe I get there on a week-by-week basis for the Florida Gators. Brandon Olsen, Locked On Gators. Brandon, appreciate the time.
Thank you.
LSU has a path to the playoff. It's really complicated. And I'll tell you why next. This episode is brought to you by our friends at FanDuel. They have everything you want for college football. I mean everything. They have individual games, everything for week 0 and week 1, which is really close. That's like this week. Yippee-ki-yay is what I say to that. But if you want to bet Florida State, Georgia Tech, or if you want to bet SMU and Nevada like a college football sicko, which some of you definitely are, by all means, you can do it at FanDuel. And this summer, they've got something for everyone. Every day, all summer long, they're hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus. And you can think of bets and whip them out anytime that you are in the mood. So head over to FanDuel, start making the most out of your summer or whatever is left as we get closer to the college football season. FanDuel.com, that's the place to go. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. LSU is making the playoff this year. It's not going to feel like that after week 1. I shall explain. Matt Moscona, Locked On LSU, joining me on the show. I think the Tigers are going to end up at 10-2, Matt, which I think is good enough to get them into the playoff. I think. We don't know what the 12-team playoff era is like. How does the committee rank these teams when it matters how you are seated, 1 through 15, more so than, before it was just like, who are the top 5 or 6 teams? That's all that really, really matters here. I have LSU at 10-2. Does that get them into the playoff to you? I think it does.
I am, first of all, very glad to hear you say that you're not sure if 10-2 gets you in, because I talk to a lot of people in a lot of different media markets, and they're all convinced that their team's going 10-2 and they're getting in the playoff. And there's only 7 at-large spots. There's going to be 7 SEC teams ain't getting in. 7 Big Ten teams ain't getting in.
I'm sorry, Tennessee. I'm sorry, Missouri. You're not making the playoff this year.
They might.
They could. I just don't think they're going to.
To your question, does 10-2 get LSU in? It depends on what the 10-2 looks like, because if 10-2 includes home losses to Ole Miss and Alabama, I think both of those teams finish at 10-2 or better in that scenario, and then LSU losing a home head-to-head will ultimately leave them out. So I think 10-2 could get them in, but not if the 2 losses are home losses to Ole Miss and Alabama, because I think they'll lose head-to-head tiebreakers.
So the way that I can see LSU missing the playoff, and look, tiebreakers are wonderfully exciting, sort of. LSU, if they follow the path that I'm about to lay out, might actually wind up I believe, wind up in the SEC championship game, taking on Georgia, who I think are going to win the SEC, and they're probably going to be my national championship, which is boring, but I'm sorry, they're the best team that I see going to take the field this year. So if LSU goes 10-2, but they lose week 1, as I am predicting them to do against USC, but then they have just one SEC loss, well, suddenly they could play in the conference championship game. But then if they do play Georgia and they lose, as they did a couple years ago, if memory serves,
yes,
is 10-3 getting you into the playoff?
Nope.
That's a fascinating question. Well, but it's the SEC, Matt. I think credence is going to be given to what has historically been the best conference in the country and is again in 2024.
Look at what happened a year ago. There's your lesson. Georgia was the best team in college football all year.
But that was the 4-team. That was the 4-team era, not the 12-team era.
I get it, but it's precedent. The committee had an excuse to leave a team out, and that would hang a third loss in your scenario, a third loss on LSU, and there would be a 2-loss team or teams that would leapfrog LSU the same way that last year it was an excuse to leave Georgia out. The bottom line, Spencer, in my opinion, is I can't see a scenario where a committee with representation from all over the country favors so heavily one league over the other 3 power leagues. So I think there will be 3 SEC teams in. 4 if there is an inarguable 4th. the people saying there's going to be 5 or 6 or 7, like, that's just not sensible. There aren't enough spots.
5 is the absolute max. Everything lines up perfectly. The right games are won. And I mean, 5 is the absolute max. I think 3 is the minimum. And 4 is probably the number where I think the SEC winds up at.
If you go back and look, and I've done this exercise so many times in the history of the 14 playoff, and look at how many times an SEC team in the penultimate rankings, right, the rankings that set the bowls. If you look at how many times the SEC had 4 in the top 11, because remember there's a G5, so there's only 11 spots really. How many
G5,
times?
goodness.
It's only a few times that the SEC had 4 in that number. More often than not, it's 3. So it may be 4 this year, but I do not think the norm is going to be 4. The norm is going to be 3. And in a stretch year, your scenario, the everything goes your way, it's 4.
I just wonder if the committee will look at LSU with what I'm about to lay out here with their schedule. If they have this season and they go 10-2 and lose the SEC championship game, does LSU next time they do that just bow out of the SEC championship game or rest their starters to say, oh, well, you can't get a real perception? Like, I think that opens somewhat a proverbial can of worms, perhaps. But the schedule for LSU is what I like more than the team. I have questions on the defensive side of the ball. I have questions on the offensive side of the ball, which I think are more easily answered with guys like Kyron Lacey ready to fill the shoes of departing wide receivers. Garrett Nussmeier at quarterback. It's not his first season in college football, like a Dylan Raiola at Nebraska, for instance. But I think they're losing week 1. I want your reaction to this schedule because, again, I think it works out really well for LSU. I think they're losing week 1 to USC. Brian Kelly 0-2 in week 1 games in his career so far in Baton Rouge. I think Lincoln Riley makes that 0-3. Then they play Nichols. I think they'll be okay. At South Carolina, that's a win. I think they will dog race UCLA. South Alabama, not close. I think Ole Miss is a home loss. Arkansas and Texas A&M are road wins. I like LSU more than Texas A&M year 3 versus year 1. I think Bama at home is a win in a close football game. At Florida is a win. Vanderbilt is a win. And Oklahoma, because it's at home, though I'd probably take LSU on the road even in Norman this year, I think that's a win. So that's how I land 10-2. Only SEC losses to Ole Miss, who I really, really like this year. But I think under this scenario, Ole Miss does not play in the SEC championship game. LSU does. And Ole Miss is a more surefire playoff bet in this world than is LSU.
If LSU gets a third loss, then I would agree. But I think you're also discounting Tennessee, Missouri, who I think have a great chance to finish 10-2 because of their schedules.
They have a chance. I think Missouri more so than Tennessee. Tennessee's got more tough games than Missouri on it.
They are the 2 weakest schedules in the SEC, right along with Ole Miss. It shapes up very nicely and Tennessee gets Bama at home. Your scenario, though, I would push back on the Ole Miss game for this reason. Ole Miss hasn't won in Baton Rouge since 2008. And where that game falls, LSU gets a bye before they play Ole Miss. For Ole Miss, Baton Rouge will be their second of back-to-back road conference games. They go at South Carolina, at Ole Miss. And historically, it is very difficult to win back-to-back road conference games in the SEC. So I like LSU at home against Ole Miss. I think LSU beats Bama at home as well. I think 10-2 is very plausible for LSU, and it may be the opener against USC. I know LSU's a touchdown favorite in that game, but I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility that LSU struggles on the road or at a neutral site and loses that game. I think the trap spot is the game at College Station. It's the second of back-to-back road conference games for LSU. Mm-hmm. That is actually that is actually the only game that Vegas has LSU as an underdog in right now. They got a lot of 50-50 games, but it's the only one where LSU's an underdog as of right now going into the season. So if you're looking for a trap spot, that's it. But the biggest swing game in the season's Ole Miss for the reasons we talked about. Huge for tiebreaker possibilities. And if LSU wins that one, they should be 6-0. I know you don't think they beat USC, but they should be 6-0 if they beat Ole Miss at home.
You bring up a lot of good points about the Ole Miss game, and I see that. The reason I still come down on taking the Rebels is, this game last year, wild, crazy, all the offense and such. Whose defense do I trust more? And to me, that answer is Ole Miss. Defensive staff continuity. I think they had the better offseason, bringing in talent on the defensive side of the ball. Ole Miss got the number 1 transfer portal class. Yeah, they brought in some offensive guys, but they brought in a bunch of dudes on the defensive side of the ball as well. So that's why I lean towards Ole Miss in that game. I think there are a lot of different ways that LSU's schedule can work out to see them go 10-2, and it might be better if they lose to Ole Miss and they lose to Alabama and just avoid the SEC championship game altogether. It is why, Matt, I am so ardently opposed to auto bids. It's a ridiculous premise. I don't like it. I will lobby against it until we get rid of them in this sport. We took a step forward getting rid of divisions, and then we took the same logic that fueled divisions and we applied it to the conference championship games. It makes no sense. It never has. It never will. But I think with this schedule, it works out that LSU will find a way to end up 10-2. Is that where you have them going as well?
I kind of vacillate a lot. I think 9-3 is very possible for this team because there's landmines all over the schedule. But I'm a big believer in not only who you play, but when and where you play them. I mentioned Ole Miss after a bye. They get Bama after a bye. They get Oklahoma after they play Vanderbilt.
So a bye?
Yeah, right. So
I am sorry. Vandy takes way too many body blows on this show. I am so mean.
They deserve it.
I am so mean.
Than anybody. Put your resources into being good in sports. Anyway.
Other than baseball, Vandy baseball, legit.
A place where they actually put money into their resources because when there were 11.7 scholarships, they gave every single player an academic scholarship, so they had 35 scholarship players. It worked out for them. They could do the same in football, but they won't. I think LSU, because of the schedule, like we talked about, I'm landing toward 10-2 mostly, Spencer, because I've watched this team at practice. Brian Kelly gives us incredible access. I've probably seen 12 hours of practice of this team already, team periods and everything.
12 hours?
He lets us come watch practice.
Matt, there are media members that will cover a team for an entire season and not watch 12 hours of practice. We haven't even started the season yet.
At the time you and I are recording this, LSU just finished practice 11. Media's been invited to 9 of the 11 practices. We've seen a minimum of an hour in all 9 availabilities, including team
I think that's
periods.
confidence.
It's incredible.
That's confidence from Brian Kelly right there.
He's literally done that since he's been that's been 3 years now he's done this here. And I have no idea if he did that at Notre Dame. I don't know what he did at Notre Dame. But I've seen the defense, and they're better. They're not going to be great, but the offense the offense won't be the number 1 offense in the country like last year, but I think they'll be top 10, top 15. And the defense won't be 108th, but can they be 58th? If you close that gap, I think there's a really good chance at LSU. The Ole Miss game a year ago, they went on the road, scored 49 and lost. I think a situation like that this year, you win. So one of those swing games probably falls their way. I think they land on 10-2, but again, it's what 10-2 looks like determines whether or not they're playoff.
Yeah, that's going to be one of the most interesting parts of this 12-team playoff. Final note on that Ole Miss game is the matchup between Ole Miss's defensive line and LSU's offensive line, which could be the best in the SEC, is going to be really good. Princely and Monmielen, I might have butchered that name pronunciation. Chris Hardy Jr., Walter Nolan, like they got guys, they got dudes. And then you look at LSU and you're like, oh, look, a couple of first-round tackles. What do you know? Matt Moscona, Locked on LSU. Appreciate the time as always, Matt.
Thanks, Spencer.
Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.